Hey everyone, it's Turnro here, bringing you a tutorial video for the Warcraft 3 World Editor. And today we'll be going over quest examples. Quite a while back I made a tutorial video on how we can create quests within the triggers, both in regards to creating quests, updating quests, completing quests, and quest messages. Since that video was released, I have received quite a lot of feedback in people asking for some specific examples on how we can initiate or have quests run within actual maps. So some examples would be, what would the triggers look like if we want to have a quest update if a monster is slain, or a quest complete when we hand a quest over to the quest giver? The reason why I didn't cover these sorts of examples in the previous video was because there are literally dozens, if not hundreds of different ways that we can set up the triggers in order to actually have the quests run when we play our maps. And to show this initially, I thought that it would be too much of a hassle to include all in one video. In saying that, there are some common trigger actions and events that tend to be used when it comes to initiating and creating quests. And so we'll be going over a few examples today in this pre-made map that I have made that will show us some examples of how we can have these quests run within the maps that we make. Now keep in mind that the version of the editor that I will be using for this tutorial video will be reforged. However, the examples that I give will work for any version of the world editor that you use, even Legacy Warcraft 3. Considering that the functionality from both Legacy and Reforged is almost identical in every way. So without further ado, let's get into the triggers. So first off, we've got a melee initialization trigger, which sets up a few things before the map can be played by the player, as well as running a trigger that will create the undiscovered quests that are available for the player as they go through the map. Now keep in mind that this sort of detail I have covered in my previous tutorial video, how to create quests and mark them as completed, mark them as discovered, creating quest requirements, etc. So if you would like to know more about that specific part within the world editor, I will put links to my previous tutorial video within the comments section and in the video description. The first example we're going to be going over today is a simple quest on going over to a village, slaying the bandits, slaying the leader, and returning a stolen item to the quest giver. So in this part here, we've got the player's hero, which is the red paladin, and then we've got the quest giver, which is the teal black bearded paladin. And within this bandits quest folder, we have an initial trigger where when a unit enters the reached paladin region, which is this one right here, and we also check to see if the entering unit of the unit who is entering the region is equal to the specific hero that we want. Then first of all, we turn off the trigger to prevent the trigger from running multiple times. We set the quest as discovered. We create all of the quest requirements, and then we display the quest message as per usual. And here we can see an example of what the quest message may look like when the player plays it in-game. In addition to that, we also do a couple of other things for different purposes. So you'll notice that I'm using a special effect here called Talk to Me 1. And this is a special effect in Warcraft 3 where an exclamation mark appears on top of the character. And this special effect I have created at the start of the game, where I go to create a special effect attached to the overhead, which will appear by default on the quest giver. And then I literally select the exclamation mark right here. So we'll close that. In addition to that, I also set a variable for that special effect. So when the quest is discovered, we no longer need that exclamation mark special effect, so we destroy it. We create a visibility modifier circle for the certain area of the map where we want the player to be. So on the mini-map, there will be an area of the map revealed to display or indicate to the player where they need to go. And we also do a couple of other things, such as we create a ping. So on the minimap, there will be a circle flash that appears to indicate where the player should go. And if the player for any reason misses it, then we can set a spacebar point where they can click on the spacebar on their keyboard, and when it will literally take them to the last location which the game needed to notify them of something significant. The game does this automatically for whenever you build a building or train a unit, but you can also set this within the triggers itself if you want the player to more easily find places of significance that you need the player to be or go throughout the game. So, we also have a new trigger here where as soon as the player reaches this region right here, then we update the quest to say that they have reached the village, which is pretty straightforward. We mark the quest as completed, and we set the quest message, and we also indicate on the map where the player needs to be as well. Now, one issue you may have in regards to having quests where there are multiple steps that need to be done in sequential order is that we need a way to ensure that the player completes the first part of the quest before the second part runs. So in this example, we want the player to actually receive the quest from the quest giver before they actually go to this region to update the quest. And the way we would do that is there's multiple ways we can do that. So one way is that we can simply just turn off this trigger by default. And that will mean that regardless if the trigger has an event, this trigger will not run. And then within the actual point in the game where we want the trigger to be enabled, we would simply create a new action, go to T for trigger, we go to turn on, and then we would turn on quest 1 update 1. And that was how one way you can go about solving that issue. Another thing you can do is you can actually delete the event altogether so that the quest never runs, and you can simply create a new action and go to T for trigger and essentially add the event to that trigger on the fly, such as we go to quest update 1 and then we select a new event when a unit enters a certain region. And that will pretty much do what you need it to do. So we will just re-add that event to the trigger that we are in at the moment. And there we go. So once the player has reached the village, the next part of the quest is to slay the bandit minions. And what we have here is 3 bandit minions, and we simply have an event where if a unit owned by player 2 dies, we check to see if all the bandit minions have been slain, we turn off the trigger to ensure it doesn't rerun again, and then we mark that quest requirement as completed, and we make the way available for the player to actually slay the bandit lord. Now what I've done here is I've created an individual condition for each unit that needs to be slain. However, depending on the purpose of your mat, you may find this insufficient, in which case you may actually be better off making a unit group, for example. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a new unit group. We're going to call it Bandit Group. We are going to set it as a unit group type. And then within our melee initialization trigger, around about here, we are going to add some new units to that unit group. So if we scroll down all the way to here, we go add unit. So we will add, when we select this unit, we'll add that to bandit group. We will copy that trigger and paste it a couple of times, and then we will add the remaining bandits to that group. And the last one right here. And then going back to the trigger where we slay the bandits, all we need to do is we just delete these and we add a new condition where we check if all the units within a specific unit group are dead. And then we do that. Once the bandit minions are slain, then we have another quest up requirement where if the enforcer unit or the bandit lord dies, then we update the quest yet again, but this time we have a fat loot item that drops on the ground where the enforcer is dead. And we also assign the newly created item a variable that is of an item type, so that we can refer to that item later on within our triggers. We also do some cleanups such as making sure that the fat loot is invulnerable so that the player doesn't actually accidentally destroy the item. Then we have another quest update trigger where if the player acquires an item, and the condition we have here is if the item being manipulated or if the player acquires the item is equal to the fat loot that was just dropped by the bandit lord, then we also turn off the trigger, we update the quest requirement and message, and then we create another special effect of an exclamation mark indicating to the player that it's time to turn the quest in. And then finally, the player will be able to go back to the quest giver, and then as before, we have a when the player reaches the paladin region, which is right here, providing that it is the actual hero that we want that belongs to the player, and providing that the player actually has the fat loot item, then we will complete the quest. We remove the fat loot item from the hero's inventory, and we destroy the exclamation mark special effect on the quest giver. So that example demonstrates how we can incorporate maps when we want to slay enemies, turn in items, and slay bosses, for example. But there is a little more variety with what we could do with quests than that. This second example involves collecting 6 gemstones. Whereas in the previous quest, we had an example of where the enemy drops a fat loot and we hand in the fat loot. In this example, it's not so much a specific item that we want, but more of a multitude of different items that we can collect. So this quest I have made to initialize the moment that the player enters the region where the enchanted gemstones are located. And as before, when the player enters the region, the trigger turns off, we create the quest requirements, we send the quest message, we make the area visible on the minimap, and we also ping the minimap as well. The main part of this quest is when it comes to the player acquiring the item. So the first condition that we have is an item type comparison, where the item type of the item being manipulated is equal to the enchanted gemstone item that we are after, which is slightly different to the condition we have in the previous quest where we are looking at a specific item comparison, whereas here we are looking at an item type comparison. One other thing that we are doing is we are also checking against what is called an integer, which we have created a variable for that keeps track of how many gemstones the player has actually found in the map. So this trigger ensures, or condition ensures, that this trigger doesn't run if they accidentally collect more of the same item than they should. But each time this trigger runs, when the player collects a gemstone, first of all, we increment or add 1 additional point to the number of gemstones variable. We remove the item because the item doesn't need to be stored within the hero's inventory. Then we have an if-else condition right here, where we check if the number of gemstones that the player has found is equal to 6, And if it is, then we turn off this trigger and we turn on quest to completed so that the quest can be handed in to the quest giver. We complete the quest requirement and now we actually display the quest message, as well as creating the talk to me exclamation mark special effect and pinging on the minimap. Otherwise, if the player is still collecting the gemstones, we can simply update the quest message to give the player an indication of how many gemstones they've collected so far. And you'll notice that the quest requirement text is missing from this main quest update. And the reason why is because we have actually incorporated separate quest requirement messages that will display below the initial main quest update text. And this gives us the flexibility to make the quest requirement wording dynamic depending on how many gemstones the player has actually found. So first of all, we've got the quest requirement, and then we do what is called a connection of strings, where we have a collect 6 gemstones, and then we go plus, and then we have convert the value of number of gemstones into a string value, which essentially means that the actual number itself, whether it be 1, 2, 3, etc., appears in the quest message of 6 found. And then below that, we have the individual quest requirement of return to the quest giver. And so providing that the player has actually collected all 6 gemstones, then the trigger to return the quest into the quest giver is pretty similar to the same quest where we return after slaying the bandits. So overall, not too different in regards to layout of the triggers, but it is a different example of a different quest type which you may want to incorporate in your maps. And then finally, the third example that I'm going to show you is a quest involved in how to build a base, where you have a requirement of the player building a specific amount of buildings or a specific buildings or training certain units or how many. In this case, it's just going to be a simple human base with minimum units and buildings. And like the gemstone quest, we are going to initiate this quest when the player enters this region right here. And if the entering unit is indeed the player hero, we turn it off. We do some setup based stuff, which is this trigger right here, where we set the player's resources to a certain amount, give them ownership of the town hall and some peasants so that they can actually build a base. And then we set the individual quest requirements, quest message, etc., etc. So one of the triggers that we use in order to identify if the player has been constructing their base is demonstrated through this barracks built trigger, which I've created, where if the player finishes construction of any building, we check to see if in a unit type comparison condition, if the unit type of the constructed structure is equal to a barracks from this drop down list, then we turn off the trigger and we set the quest requirement as completed, and then we run a trigger called run quest 3 update. And what this does is it acts as a centralized trigger that displays the quest update message each time the player finishes a building or an upgrade or training a unit. And this is an alternative approach to setting up triggers instead of having an individual trigger for each time a quest updates. Now, of course, this structure depends on how you want the quest to unfold, but in situations where the quest is sort of repetitive and it requires similar steps to be done, such as in this case building a base, it may be more ideal to have the actual quest message logic contained within a centralized trigger. And essentially what we do is we check to see if all of the base building requirements have been completed, and in which case we will run the quest 3 completed, which will complete the quest and display the main quest completed message to the player. Else, we display the base main quest update message to the player, and then for each individual quest requirement, we check to see if the quest requirement has been completed. If it has, then we will display a completed quest to indicate that that building has been completed. Else, we still show that that quest is yet to be fulfilled by the player. Where this can differ slightly is, for example, when it comes to farm building. So in this case, we want the player to build a certain number of farms instead of one single farm. And for this purpose, we have created a number integer variable called number farms build, which will increase each time the player completes a new structure that is of a farm. And then we simply check to see if the number of farms is indeed equal to 3, in which case we can turn off this trigger. We can set the quest requirement as completed. Else, we can change the quest requirement description. Now, this is an option if you want to display to the player the number of items that they have fulfilled for a particular type of quest if they go to view that quest in the quest log. It is similar to what we have done with the quest messages, except in this case we are actually modifying the actual quest requirement in the quest log area of the game instead, which is we add a bunch of string characters together, and one of them is the number value of how many farms the player has actually built. And when the player completes this quest, then we refresh the quest requirement description to just say build 3 farms, since the number of farms have been completed at that point. Another example of a requirement of base building is when it comes to training footmen. So if we go over to the footman train trigger, instead of the trigger running when a building is constructed, instead we are having it run when a unit has finished training by the player. In which case the unit type of that trained unit will be of a footman from this option here. And providing that the number of footmen has not been reached, then we will increment the number footmen trained variable that we have created. And then we will check to see if the number of footmen trained is equal to 5, in which case we will complete the quest requirement and reset the requirement description. Else, we will update the quest within, or the quest requirement within the quest log to indicate how many footmen the player has trained so far. Finally, the only other building requirement that we haven't covered yet is with the keep. Now, unlike most other buildings that we've covered so far, the keep is technically not a brand new building. It is upgrading an existing building, where the player here has the town hall and they need to upgrade it to a keep. And so the trigger around that is we have a completely different event where if the player finishes an upgrade, and we check to see if the unit type of triggering unit is equal to the keep. Now, one thing to note about when it comes to event responses is that so far I've been taking you through examples on what to select depending on what you want to do, which in most cases is important in order to actually tell the game which unit you are actually referring to, such as if you have a trigger run when a unit dies, you need to use dying unit, or if a unit enters a region, you need to use entering unit, etc. However, if you are slightly confused about this approach, a general alternative to this is to just use triggering unit, which doesn't matter what event you're using in order to initiate or have the trigger run, this will pick up the unit that has initiated the trigger to run. And so in that case, providing that the player reaches all of the individual quest requirements in order to construct the base and train the units, the quest will complete. And that pretty much concludes the examples on how we can incorporate quests in our own maps. I hope you found this tutorial quite useful. I will be providing a link to this map within the comments and video description below so that you can check out the map for yourself and play around with it. This map is reforged only, so I do apologize if you only use the legacy version and you wish to play around with this map. But in future, when I release these maps for future tutorial videos, I will try to make it so that you can use these maps regardless of which Warcraft 3 world editor you use. So without further ado, I will catch you all next time. Bye now.